The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning, Sean. Can you hear me okay on your end?
I can.
Okay, great. I can hear you too. Good morning, folks. We're going to give it here about a minute, let other folks get logged in, and we will get our webinar started here shortly. Okay, I see the attendees jumping up. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this sunny day in Washington State. My name is Rick Gastelum. I am the Chief Financial Officer at the Washington Farm Bureau. A little bit about myself. I grew up I come from a farm working family out in Eastern Washington in Sunnyside. And I have been working for the Farm Bureau since 2008. I used to work as a safety director with our retro safety and claims program, going around the state, helping educate our employers on workplace safety and health best practices, human resources, labor management, and other issues. And in my current role as CFO, not only in charge of our finances, but helping also deliver human resources, labor management, educational seminars like our Ag HR Bootcamp series, the Farm Bureau Solutions services that we have been slowly rolling out over the last couple of years, and topics like this webinar we're here doing for you today. So today's webinar is on the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, or FFCRA is sort of the long acronym that's been applied to it. And myself and Sean Worley, and I'll have Sean introduce himself before we continue on in the webinar, but we're going to present to you the overview of what is involved in the act that went into effect April 1st. And it's an emergency temporary rule that's in effect through December of 2020. We'll give you an overview of it. And I didn't get any pre-submitted questions, but I have some questions at the end that have been common ones that have come up with myself. I've been working closely with Sean on this. And so during the webinar, if you have questions, I'll ask that you submit them in the question box, and then when we're wrapped up with the presentation portion, we will go back and do our best to answer those questions for you. With that, Sean, can you kind of introduce yourself to the group, please?
Sure, thanks, Rick. So my name is Sean Worley. I'm an attorney out of Yakima, Washington at the law firm Meyer, Fluegge, and Tenney. Just some of my background. I've been living in Yakima almost my entire life, so around a lot of farming community, and left town a little bit to go to college, but ultimately found my way back here. And I found that living in the rural central Washington is more my speed, and I enjoy working with employers and in agriculture and things along those lines. Before I got into employment law, I was a prosecutor at the Yakima County Prosecutor's Office, and I've been practicing employment law for about 4 years now. I was at the prosecutor's office for about years before that. And yeah, like Rick said, I've been working with him on a lot of these issues, as well as I like to present for the Farm Bureau whenever they give me the opportunity to at their boot camps and things like that. My practice involves pretty much every area of employment law you can imagine, and with the coronavirus and everything that's been going on, changing day to day, I've been helping employers to get up to speed and try to adjust as things are changing day to day, like I said.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sean. And while I'll be doing a majority of the talking during the presentation piece, I love to have Sean on my team because he can sort of help wrangle me in if I kind of get out of control or I start interpreting things far into left field. But no, we've built a good partnership the last couple of years, and Sean will intervene on some of the more complex questions or interpretive questions that we have while coming up. Last little announcement before we get going, there are 3 handouts that I loaded up to the webinar. I do realize you may have an issue trying to download a PDF copy of the PowerPoint. What I will do is I will look to email that out to all of the attendees of the webinar after the webinar is over, so you can have a copy of that. I'm also recording this broadcast. For anybody that wants to later go back and refer to it, share it with your friends, business partners, anybody else that you'd like to see it. We will have it on our Washington Farm Bureau YouTube channel, and I'll talk more about that at the end, but it will be available for viewing on our YouTube station. So with that, let's get started. So we want to talk about, is this really Rona relief, or is it a major Rona headache? For anytime new labor laws come down, they seem to be a headache. They seem to be confusing. But no, truly, it is meant to be relief for workers. Most employers, a majority of employers, I don't know any that are blatantly just don't like their workers. They know they're an essential part of our business. They know we need our workers to help us keep our businesses operating. And so this relief package, like I said, is in effect from April 1st of 2020 through December 31st of 2020. And it covers emergency paid sick leave and emergency family medical leave for your workers when there are certain COVID-19 qualifying events. We're going to cover both those topics during this webinar. We're also going to cover what is the documentation, and I put documentation in quotes because documentation means different things when we're talking about what the employee needs to provide to the employer and how that can be communicated, and then what the employer needs to document on their end for documenting the leave. We're also going to chat about the interplay of the Washington paid sick leave rules and the Washington paid family leave benefit. If you remember, Washington paid sick leave, I believe are we already now 2 years into that, where employers were required to start providing employees Washington paid sick leave benefits based on how many hours they worked. And then the Washington paid family leave benefit that is administered by Employment Security. Workers starting January 1st of 2020 are now able to apply for and receive those benefits if they qualify. So we'll talk about some of the interplay of that when there are COVID-19 qualifying events. I will also inform you about the tax credits for employers to assist you in covering some of these wages and benefits you may need to provide. And then we will wrap up the webinar with some Q&A. So with that, let's talk about who is covered by the Family First Coronavirus Response Act rules. So it's any employer that has 500 employees or less in the United States. So what you do is you take a head count of your total employment at the time an employee is submitting to you for leave, or they have the qualifying event that they're communicating to you. So it's the day of, that is when you take your head count. Now this head count needs to include all of your full-time workers, part-time workers, seasonal workers, any employees that are currently on your payroll, even those that may be currently on leave at that time of the event. If they're on vacation, sick leave, bereavement leave, if they're still on your payroll record as an employee, then you would include them in that head count. If you fall with under 500 employees or less, then you must provide all of the benefits due to the worker based on the type of event. Now, there is a small business exemption that was built into the temporary rules for 50 employees or less. However, this exemption is only available under certain COVID-19 related reasons, and I'm going to cover that. So it's not any and all COVID related situations where a small business can get out of having to provide those benefits, but we're going to cover that with you. So here's the high level overview. So the first major benefit is the emergency paid sick leave. This in essence provides a worker 2 weeks of paid sick leave up to a total of 80 hours at the employee's regular rate of pay, and it lists these COVID related reasons, and I'll get into that here when we jump more into the COVID situations. It also provides 2 weeks up to 80 hours of paid sick leave at 2/3 the employee's regular rate of pay if there is a need to care for another individual who's not the worker, say somebody living in their home or their child, and then that would be covered under this emergency paid sick leave. And I'll walk through, I think I've got a good slide that lays out these COVID related events where this type of benefit would get triggered. The second major benefit that is required under this emergency rule is expanded family medical leave. This in essence would be, the rule says it's a total of 12 weeks, but the first 2 weeks are unpaid. So in essence, it's really 10 weeks of paid leave. A covered employer must provide to your employees that have been employed for you at least 30 days up to an additional 10 weeks of paid expanded family and medical leave. Now this would be at 2/3 the employee's regular rate of pay. And again, like I said, I'm going to talk about what sort of COVID related events would trigger this expanded family medical leave. Now notice the notation here, like I was saying, it's really, when you read the rule, it says it's 12 weeks of family medical leave, but the first 2 weeks are unpaid. Unless, of course, the employee substitutes 2 weeks of the emergency paid sick leave up front, okay?
And can I jump in real quick, Rick?
Yes, please.
I just add that in theory, it's possible that an employee could get these 12 weeks of expanded family medical leave, of which the first 2 weeks would be unpaid, the next 10 weeks would be paid, and that they decide not to use their emergency paid sick leave, reserving that 2 weeks for some other time. So in theory, they could take 12 weeks of expanded family medical leave to care for their child whose school or daycare is shut down, and they decide they want to hold on to those 2 weeks of emergency paid sick leave in case they get sick later, something along those lines. So in theory, it's possible that they could choose not to use those 2 weeks and save them for sometime later in the year.
Great point, Sean. Thank you. So let's go now to what are the qualifying events. And I'm sort of a visual person, and when you read the rule, it's kind of hidden in the paragraphs of the rule. So I like to sort of lay it out by buckets. So let's talk about first, what are those qualifying events that would trigger the need to provide the emergency paid sick leave? The first type of event would be one where the worker is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. Now, let's talk about what would be some examples of that. That would be, for example, let's say it is the State Department of Health, your local healthcare authority that provides direction to your worker that says you need to quarantine or isolate. Now, we've been watching Governor Inslee a lot lately talking about his tracking team, his COVID-19 tracing team that he is looking to get up and ramped up to identify people that have been and may have been exposed to individuals who have been confirmed to have COVID-19. Now, I suspect what will end up happening is this tracing team will provide directions and orders to quarantine or isolate to individuals. So those would be types of events that would fall under this event number 1. The second event that could trigger would be where a worker has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine or isolate. So this would be a family care doctor, this could be a nurse, this could be anybody in the healthcare profession that tells them they need to self-quarantine. Let me give you an example, and I'll share a personal story. When this first started late March, my daughter became very sick. She had a couple of the symptoms related to COVID-19, and her doctor ordered that I take her in to one of these mobile COVID-19 testing sites. So we did that. We stay in the car, we drive it. It's like a drive-through. The healthcare professionals come out in their full PPE. They do the swab. We leave, and prior to us leaving, they give us a generic document that basically says, okay, person, you have been tested for COVID-19. You need to self-quarantine until we provide you the results of that test. And it did not have her name on it. It did not have my name on it. It was not what I call a typical doctor's note that we may be used to. But it was a generic form that was provided by the medical provider, and it basically gave directions she needed to self-quarantine. So had she been a worker in that scenario, this is direction from that healthcare provider that's telling me I need to self-quarantine. Third type of an event would be an employee that is experiencing some of the COVID symptoms, and I'll want to direct you, please make sure you pay attention to the latest list of symptoms from the CDC. When this first started coming out in March, they were saying it was the classic symptoms were fever, body aches, and I believe dry cough. That now has expanded. I think they added 5 or 6 more symptoms to that. I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but I think they've even added like nausea, diarrhea, and some other stuff. So if your employee is communicating that, hey, I'm experiencing any one of these 8 or 9 symptoms, and they are seeking a medical diagnosis, then that would trigger the need to provide the emergency paid sick leave should they choose to want to use it. Notice though, this says, and seeking a medical diagnosis. That's very important. A worker that is simply reporting to you they're having symptoms and is not communicated that they are then following up with a medical provider, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to provide the leave, but here I think is a great point. Sean, can you kind of jump in? We've had some scenarios where some workers have said they've had symptoms but aren't seeking that. What would you recommend an employer do? What should they be communicating to that worker if they have not communicated they're seeking a diagnosis? Should they just automatically not provide the leave, or what's your recommendation?
What I would do is I'd recommend writing up a letter that notifies them that they may qualify for this leave if they are seeking diagnosis. I'd also indicate that the fact that they're experiencing symptoms or believe they're experiencing symptoms, because of that, they should remain away from the workplace for at least depends on how you interpret things, but at least 24 hours following the last noticeable symptoms. Some people are interpreting that as 72 hours because the CDC applies that to healthcare workers. But you tell them to stay away from work, they may qualify if they're seeking medical diagnosis, and to inform them that if they are seeking medical diagnosis, to provide documentation that I think that we're going to get into here in a little bit to support that leave. There is not a obligation under the Act to provide notice that they may qualify. as would apply to regular FMLA. But I've been advising people to do that to show that you are abiding by at least going above and beyond to try to abide by your obligations. And I also think it goes a long way to showing that you're trying to create a safe and healthful workplace, which isn't required under these regulations, but is required under OSHA and WSHA.
Right, good point. So the fourth qualifying event down here in this red box would be caring for another individual that's subject to an order described in one, from a government agency to quarantine or isolate, or in two, they've been advised by a healthcare provider. So classic examples of this would be you have a worker whose spouse or partner they're living with has fallen ill or is told to quarantine or isolate, and that person has a bona fide need to be cared for, meaning let's say they have Alzheimer's or they have other disabilities that prevent them even in normal life to being able to care for themselves, or the COVID is such that it has stricken that person, they're completely just out of it and they need assistance, or a child is fallen ill or told to self-quarantine and that worker simply can't come into work. That would be under number 4. The fifth one would be caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed for reasons related to COVID-19. So this was pretty much all of Washington State right now. All schools are shut down. So if there is a worker that says, look, the school is closed, I don't have childcare, I don't have anywhere for my kid to be at, I just simply cannot be at work, that could be a qualifying event there. That would be a qualifying event under this emergency paid sick leave. The last one, number 6, and I just double checked this morning, and I'm going to share with you the frequently asked questions on DLO's website, but they did put into the rule something that says if the person is experiencing any other substantially similar condition specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretaries of Labor and Treasury. These are all federal agencies and departments, and none of them have come out yet and say, oh, these scenarios are ones that would fit under number 6. So for right now, you just need to be paying attention to those 5. Now, under the when does the family medical leave kick in? There's only one event where that 12 weeks of leave would kick in, and that's the employee qualifies for the expanded family leave if the employee is caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed due to COVID reasons. So this is the same one as number 5 above. There's a lot of confusion out there because people think 1, 2, 3, and 4 above also apply in the family medical leave event. That's not correct. It's just for child-caring issues that person may have related to COVID-19. Sean, anything else you'd like to point out on this slide before I move to the next one?
It's not necessarily related to the slide, but I guess sort of. Don't forget that if an employee has a coronavirus or is feeling sick or something like that, it's possible that they could qualify for the regular federal FMLA, not this expanded FMLA. It just won't be paid. So you want to keep an eye out for those issues as well. So although this new emergency family medical leave only applies to caring for your child if their school or a place of care is closed, if somebody has coronavirus, they're probably going to be out for a while, and that might be a serious health condition. So just keep that in mind.
Good point. Okay, and here's just another reminder there for the expanded family medical leave. It's only for child care issues, and like we were saying a little bit ago, it could be a total of 12 weeks of leave, where the first 2 weeks are under the emergency sick leave, and then the next 10 weeks are under the expanded family medical leave. Now, I put in here again, there is that exemption for employers with 50 or less employees. You may qualify to be exempt from providing both the emergency paid sick leave, or the expanded family medical leave when we have a child care event if, quote, doing so would jeopardize the viability of the small business as a going concern. Now, there's a lot of consideration that needs to be made before you can just simply state we are exempt, and you will find those in the frequently asked question number 58 and 59. And after the webinar, I'll have mine and Sean's contact information. If you need help navigating that, we can assist you. Next here, let's talk about how you calculate pay. Okay, so you have an event, you believe it's bona fide, you've determined it's either paid sick leave or the emergency family leave. How do you calculate the pay? So let's go through the first three types of scenarios you might encounter. When the worker themselves has COVID-19, they are experiencing symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis, or they are told to self-quarantine or isolate. How do you calculate those wages? Well, under that rule, and they are asking to use the emergency paid sick leave, you would calculate their regular rate or the applicable minimum wage, whichever is higher, up to a maximum of $511 per day and $5,110 in the aggregate over an entire 2-week period. And now, Sean, I've got aggregate underlined here on all three of these. Is this, if I've got, and I'm going to walk through these other pay rates, but I've got a worker that, let's say they exhaust their first 2 weeks here in May, they have another event in October, are they due another 2-week period, or what does that total aggregate mean in all three of these types of situations?
So the way that I interpret it is that means that you have up to 2 weeks to be used until the end of the year. It's not 2-week time frame that you can use all of or half of the 2 weeks now, and then you get a full 2 weeks later. If you use half the 2 weeks now, you still only have a half left.
So it's total aggregate.
You have 1 more week.
So what it basically is total aggregate required April 1st through December 31st whenever you use it.
Correct.
Total leave available. Okay. So then we go to the next grouping of scenarios when the worker's caring for someone else, so another individual who's under quarantine or told to self-isolate. This would be at 2/3 the regular rate of pay, or 2/3 the applicable minimum wage, whichever's higher, up to a maximum of $200 per day and $2,000 in aggregate over that 2-week period. Okay, so those first two are how you calculate the pay if we're doing emergency paid sick leave. Okay, now let's go to if we need to do expanded family medical leave or emergency paid sick leave when the worker is caring for a child because of school or child care closure. This again would be at 2/3 the regular rate of pay or 2/3 the applicable minimum wage, whichever's higher. And again, it's capped at $200 per day and $12,000 in the aggregate over a 12-week period. And remember, 2 weeks of that paid leave could potentially also then be followed up by 10 weeks of paid expanded family and medical leave. And when we get towards the end, I've got the frequently asked question numbers that talk a lot about if you have part-time employees, seasonal employees, employees that work irregular hours. I will direct you to those questions so you can look at when you're trying to figure out what that regular rate should be or how to figure the average wages or time missed. There's some interpretation there. Sean, before I move on from this slide, anything else you want to touch on?
That's what I was going to touch on, the part-time or irregular hours, so we can wait to hit on that.
Okay, good. Yep, we'll get to that here. Now let's jump on what sort of documentation is required, and it's very similar, but yet there's a few differences when we're talking employee and employer. So first off, you have an employee that has come to you and said, hey, I have this qualifying event. I'd like to use leave, either the emergency paid sick leave or the family medical leave. The rule says they must provide the following orally or in writing, okay? Which means the employee is not necessarily required to give you all of this information in writing. They are allowed to verbally communicate this information to you, although they are still required to provide the following. Again, their name, dates or date for which they are requesting the leave, the reason for the leave, and a statement that they are unable to work because of the qualifying reason. So it needs to fit one of those criteria, one of those COVID-19 events we talked about a little bit ago. If they're requesting the leave because the employee is subject to a quarantine or isolation order or to care for an individual subject because of such an order, they also need to provide the name of the government entity that issued the order. And again, this is for the employer, so you can verify this. Or if they are doing it because it's based on the advice of a healthcare provider, they should be giving you the name of that healthcare provider. So again, you can verify that. Now, Sean, have you heard of any medical providers that won't talk to employers related to any of this? If the information's only been given verbally and the employer's trying to verify that with the medical provider?
I have had some pushback from medical providers. What I've seen is they're handing out sort of a form that says that the Department of Health recommends that employers do not require a doctor's note. And what I've been saying in response to that is that's fine. And you don't necessarily have to have a note, but what you need to have is the name of the healthcare provider, and the employee has to give that to you. If you have that information, then that should suffice in terms of the employee's obligation to provide documentation, as well as Rick will talk here in a moment, the employer's obligation to maintain documentation.
Right. And I think too, one of the reasons they allowed the verbal communication of this information and not requiring an actual written doctor's note is, and it makes sense on this argument, is that they don't want to be inundating medical providers right now with having to create individualized what we're used to as seeing doctor's notes. And so you're getting some of these more generic forms. But again, there's no reason the worker still can't help get you the government agency's name that issued the order and the name of the healthcare provider that might have issued that order. If the request for leave is to care for a child whose school or place of childcare is closed, they should be providing you the name of the child, the name of the school, place of care, or child care provider that's closed or become unavailable because of COVID-19, and a statement that no other suitable person is available to care for their child. So that would be in that number 5 COVID-19 reason under the paid sick leave, or the only reason under the family medical leave. It's the second set of bullets that the employee is required to communicate to you. Now for employers, you're going to notice here, this list is pretty much all the same. The major difference is now the burden to document truly does fall on the employer, okay? You must document the following information. Notice I underlined if you grant or deny the leave, and this is for every single scenario that you may encounter for each different worker that you may have to document. So this would be if you grant the leave or deny it, you need to document the name the employee requesting the leave, the dates, the reason for the leave, basically a statement that qualifies why they're unable to work. So it should be tied back to one of those COVID-19 qualifying events. And then again here, the name of the government entity that issued the order, the name of the healthcare provider that may have issued the order, and the very same information that the worker would need to provide related to school closure or childcare, you would document the same. So in this level, the burden of proof is a little bit more on the employer in needing to document that. So now let's talk a little bit about the interplay of Washington paid sick leave and the Washington paid family leave during some of these events. And Sean, I'll be looking to you to intervene here on some of these. I'll cover it and then I'll have you jump in. When the worker themselves has COVID-19, or they have symptoms and are seeking a medical diagnosis, or they're told to self-quarantine or isolate, we've talked about different events that could trigger that, they would be eligible to use any of their accrued balance of Washington paid sick leave if they choose. Now, kind of the rule of thumb would be if the worker chooses to, they would typically first use the new Family First coronavirus paid sick leave. Then once that's exhausted, if they choose, they could use the Washington paid sick leave. Once all that leave is exhausted, if they still cannot return to work, the employee could apply for Washington paid family leave. And this is that benefit I was saying that's administered by Employment Security. If the worker's caring for someone else who's under quarantine or told to isolate, same type of deal, they would be eligible to use any of the accrued balance of paid sick leave. If the worker chooses to, this would be used after the Family First coronavirus emergency leave is used up and the expanded family medical leave is exhausted. Same scenario, once all of that's exhausted, then they could possibly turn to Washington paid family leave, and that would kick in. When the worker is simply caring, if it's the COVID event where they're caring for a child because the school or child care is closed, we do not believe neither Washington paid sick leave or paid family leave applies. However, I'm going to have Sean jump in at this point and give some of the things you want to make sure you're considering related to this interplay here of all the different leaves.
Yeah, and so this is where the FFCRA really gets kind of confusing. And so the first point that I'd emphasize is that, as Rick pointed out, the general rule of thumb is that if they're using taking time off for their own symptoms, diagnosis, self-quarantine, things like that, generally the rule of thumb is that they're going to use the emergency paid sick leave first. But the way that the regulations are written is that they say that you cannot force them to use some other benefit first, but it leaves open to interpretation whether or not they have the option to use some other benefit first. So I would interpret that to say that if they want to use Washington paid sick leave first, they can. You should err on the side of having them use the emergency paid sick leave first unless they tell you so. That's why it's phrased that way on this slide. And so that's the first thing that I emphasize. Now with when we're dealing with all these issues though, you still want to make sure to think about the unpaid FMLA and or ADA issues. So there is going to be overlap, and some of these other leaves might come into play after the paid portions are used up. And so if somebody exhausts all of their emergency paid sick leave and Washington paid sick leave, and it's for their own illness because they were diagnosed with coronavirus. Now at that point, they've run out of paid leave under the emergency paid sick leave and Washington state paid sick leave. But you want to make sure they're getting their notice that they may qualify for Washington paid family and medical leave. And you also want to make sure that they're getting their notice that they may qualify for the federal unpaid FMLA. And after that's used up, or if they don't want to use that for whatever reason, throughout this time you need to be thinking about the reasonable accommodation process with the ADA to see if there's some accommodation that can allow them to perform their job, or how much leave they may need to have so that when they are they can recover and they can come back and work. One thing to emphasize too with the ADA, and sort of comes into play with the emergency paid sick leave, is that you're only entitled to the emergency paid sick leave if you're unable to work because of one of those qualifying reasons. And that includes working remotely. So this likely won't apply to your general ag workers, but some of your office employees, you need to be thinking about, is it possible for them to work remotely or not? And that's something to think about throughout the process and before determining whether or not they qualify for emergency paid sick leave, but also after anyone's exhausted their entitlements that are paid, looking to the ADA and Washington law against discrimination and saying, okay, at this point, we know that you need more leave, or we know that you can't come back into the workplace, but what sort of accommodation might be available to either allow you to perform your job remotely or to get back to work and perform it under the normal conditions?
Right, good points. And so you can see if you have an employee that has very, what I'll call extended or long-term COVID-19 related situations or complications, you need to be paying attention to see if any of these other leave or disability rules apply. And that's where I highly recommend you please reach out to myself. I probably will be directing you to Sean though, because there's some things you want to be carefully considering if you have any of these. My hope is that a majority of folks, you're only having to deal with a few weeks of this, and that the lengthier ones will be more of the rare situations that you may not even have to encounter. But I do suspect there's a good chance you may experience within your workforce these short-term situations. So.
And just real quick, I agree. I think that it's probably there's going to be a handful of people that have to deal with the ongoing issues, but some of you might. And so to kind of help to walk through this in your mind to make sure you're not forgetting something, when somebody's requesting leave and it seems like they're going to be out for a while, I'd have just a kind of a list of each one of these leaves next to the phone or wherever it is that you handle these situations, maybe just in your shirt pocket that lists emergency paid sick leave, Washington state paid sick leave, emergency FMLA, regular FMLA, ADA, so that you, and just bullet points there so that you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I need to think about these things and make sure I'm not missing something.
All right, great point, great point. Next thing now, after we've touched here on the interplay, let's talk about the tax credits for businesses. So related to this, related to the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, the IRS is providing business tax credits for benefits that employers may pay from April 1st to December 31st. Eligible employers, what you will do if you've met all of the qualifying events, you've paid these wages out, you're going to claim the credits on your federal employment tax returns. For most employers, it's probably your Form 941, okay? If you need to claim the benefit more quickly than just quarterly, what you do is you would reduce your federal employment tax deposits. Now, if you work with a CPA or a bookkeeper, an accountant, you'd want to work with them to figure out how to do that. Eligible employers will report their total qualified leave wages on these payroll tax reports. Now, the credits are to cover 100% of up to 10 days of the qualified sick leave wages and up to 10 weeks of the qualified family leave wages. So basically, on the IRS side of the rules, they are covering up to a maximum aggregate amount allowed per worker from April through December. So if you have one of those workers that qualifies and you pay out, let's say, the max 80 hours, 2 weeks of wages, I believe it was just a hair over $5,100 in wages to that worker, you would claim that entire $5,100 in wages on your employment quarterly tax filing. When I read through the IRS website, again, we haven't gotten to that first quarterly tax filing yet. That would be after quarter 2 of this year, which will end June 30th of 2020. The way they're stating is it will be an immediate tax credit. It's not something where the IRS is going to send you back a refund check. So for example, let's say you have $100,000 in payroll taxes due for Q2, but yet you paid out $5,000 in benefits. Instead of you having to pay $100,000 to the IRS, you would only owe $95,000. So while employers are on the hook to have to pay these wages out for cash flow purposes today, you should be able to recover that cash with each of your quarterly filings. But it is up to 100%. Now, if you choose to provide more leave and dollars than the rule requires, you are not eligible to recover that. It's only the maximums match up with the IRS and the FFCRA rules. So make sure you keep that in mind. And notice this little last note here too. It also covers the eligible employer share of Medicare taxes imposed on those wages, okay? But again, this isn't an accounting webinar, so you'll want to make sure to work with your accountant or financial officers or CPAs that you work with to help you do your payroll tax filings. You do have to the IRS is requiring you to maintain some documentation of any of the paid benefits that you're providing. Here's right off their website: all eligible employers will substantiate the eligibility for the sick leave or family leave credits if the employer receives, and I put a note here, written request for such leave from the employee in which the employee provides. And I refer you on our presentation, refer back to slide 9. Basically, IRS is requiring all of the same information that the Department of Labor is requiring to substantiate why the benefit was granted. Now, the IRS and DOL both say do not mail anything. There is no requirement to submit anything to them when you provide these benefits, but you better have your documentation in your files should you be audited or should it be asked for in the future. Now notice here there is a difference between what Department of Labor and IRS has said in relation to the employee communicating to the employer a need for this COVID-19 leave. DOL allows the worker to orally provide the information, but in the IRS frequently asked questions, they state the request from the employee is written. Now, because there's a difference here, here is my recommendation. If there is no written request made by the worker, but the necessary information has still been communicated to you orally or verbally, create the documentation and still it is okay to provide the leave and submit for the tax credit. Just make a note that the information was provided to you verbally. I can't see where the IRS, in good faith in a court, would be able to fine you for providing the leave, submitting for the tax credit, and them coming back saying you shouldn't have done that because you received the information verbally. Sean, is that would that be your recommendation as well?
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is one additional portion of the USDOL's regulations that might allow you to require something in writing is that the regulations say that if the employee does not give you sufficient information in order to qualify for the tax credits, then the employer is not obligated to provide the leave. However, and I don't know exactly what the IRS is going to do with this, but I agree with Rick that it just seems unreasonable for the IRS to say, well, the employee didn't give you a written request, you wrote it down. I just find it hard to believe that that's what's going to happen. So my recommendation, rather than splitting hairs, has been aligned with what Rick said, is just if the employee gives you the information orally, have the supervisor or HR, whoever's handling the requests, they write it down, and then you maintain that documentation.
Right. Good points. Okay, let's go to our next slide here. Here's some of the online resources that you should make sure are at your fingertips, and I'm going to pull some of these up. The first one is the U.S. Department of Labor FFCRA summary page. And let me pull that into view. But that URL is right in the webinar, in the web pages there, not on the PowerPoint, and I will make sure you get that. But this is a good place where it gives just the high-level overview of the paid sick leave that's required to be provided, and the paid expanded family medical leave. So like Sean was saying, you want something close by your phone or something in your shirt pocket or something you can quickly carry around. This is a good page to have quickly at your fingertip, because it also does a good job of just really bulleting out what those qualifying events are. Okay, so that's one web page I would make sure that you have quickly available. The next one is, and I've been talking about this quite a bit, I'm not always happy with Department of Labor's frequently asked questions page, but this is one that I'm actually pleasantly surprised, and I think they've done a pretty darn good job in laying it out. But this here, it's FFCRA questions, okay? And what this does is it provides the definition of paid sick leave, expanded family and medical leave. As you come down, they categorize all their questions. I think they're up to 90 some now, but they give you definitions. So when you expand this here, for example, what is a part-time employee? Well, if I click on that, it takes me right to question number 49. If you want to look at who's eligible, there may be some questions that are floating around in your mind. This is a good place to search from, and it will take you right to that. There's a section on coverage. As an employer, how do I know if my business is under 500? And actually, I'm going to answer, there was one question that came in. Somebody asked if they have multiple sites. This is the section you're going to want to look for coverage, meaning you have a business where there's common ownership and you have multiple businesses. Is there coverage? And so here's an area you will want to go and take a look at. There's also an application section here. How do you apply certain things? A section on intermittent leave. In other Q&A. As you can see here, all these red ones, these are ones that I've frequently have been going into and looking at myself. So there's that website you'll want to make sure is at your fingertips. Another one is the employment security webpage on paid family leave. Make sure you have that saved in your favorites. That's right here. This has a section once you get in there for employees and employers. Let me pull that up. For individuals and families, find it. It tells them how the leave works, how to get ready to apply, how they apply now. For employers, there's a section on your roles and responsibilities, some exemptions and responsibilities if you're a small business, which in this scenario is up to 150 employees, and filing your reports and premiums. Okay, so that's a website, paidleave.wa.gov. You're going to want to make sure you have in your favorites. The last one is the IRS COVID tax relief. Here's the URL. I will show you what that web page looks like. But right when you, and a lot of these I easily find just Googling coronavirus tax relief, IRS, and Google does a pretty good job getting us to this page here. But you see here the title, Coronavirus Tax Relief, Economic Impact Payments. The section you want to pay attention to, where I found a lot of the information for our PowerPoint today, was this section here, new employer tax credit. So if you, in watching this webinar, need to help educate your bookkeepers, accountants, CPAs, you can direct them to go here, and you will notice it starts outlining what is available, what can be paid, and then there's also frequently asked questions for small and mid-sized businesses, and their discussions of how to file for the credits and whatnot. So there are those online resources that will help you navigate the COVID-19 situations you may be experiencing in your workplace when you're dealing with the leave benefits. Now what we want to do is jump into some preloaded questions that I threw up, and then we are also going to look at questions that people have been submitting during the webinar. And so first up here we have, what if an employee, and Sean, I'm going to have you answer these with me, okay?
Yep.
Okay, so what if an employee is simply scared of contracted COVID-19 in the workplace and they do not want to come to work? Are they still eligible for the FFCRA benefits?
And the answer to that is generally no. They are not eligible for the benefits simply because they're afraid of contracting COVID-19. But I would recommend that employers ask the follow-up question, which is why? Why are you scared? Because if the reason is because of some underlying condition that they have that makes them more susceptible to contracting COVID-19, or maybe they just failed to say that their doctor recommended that they stay home. If their doctor recommended it, then they do qualify for FFCRA benefits. But if it's because of their underlying condition, just scared, there's a possibility that you may be required to accommodate their need to work. So at that point, I'd be thinking about the ADA and Washington logins discrimination.
Okay, so Sean, you were cutting out just a little bit there, but I think to summarize, you were saying if they're simply scared but they have some other underlying issues, there may be some Americans with Disabilities Act ADA considerations that the employer needs to be thinking about, correct?
Correct. Can you hear me okay right now?
Yeah, now I can. Yep.
Okay. What I'd add to that, just to make sure everybody heard it, is that you want to make sure to ask why they're scared, because that'll alert you to whether or not you might have an ADA issue. And also, if they tell you that their doctor recommended that they stay home, now we actually do have an FFCRA triggering event.
Great. Next question here. What if an employee says they have symptoms but gives no information they're seeking a medical evaluation? And we covered that earlier, but just as a reminder, again, send them a letter documenting your request that they please, that they should be seeking a medical evaluation, to make sure they're okay. And if they don't, that could be grounds for you to deny that leave. But again, you want to make sure and follow up and clearly document that you have been trying to communicate to the worker. It's important that they do seek a medical evaluation if they are wanting to use that leave benefit. Third one here, can you take employee temperatures? And I believe it was EEOC, right, Sean? Came out and said, yes, employers are allowed to take temperatures.
Correct. I actually just had to go back and refresh my memory, but yes, it was the EEOC.
Okay. Yeah, and so the reason the Equal Employment EEOC got involved was because prior to COVID-19, taking people's temperatures is considered a medical test, okay? And employers are not supposed to be acting like doctors or healthcare providers for their workers, so it was prohibited. But because of COVID-19 and the recommendations from CDC and others and the healthcare professions that employers should look at screening workers for the health and safety of the entire workforce and to prevent the spread, they're asking employers to consider taking employees' temperatures. Now, if this is a practice you want to implement in your workplace as a part of safety measures, there are some things you do need to make sure you are considering. And first is the information that you're going to collect about the worker's temperature is protected by HIPAA, okay? This is private information to that worker. So here's where I can see employers getting into some situations of not protecting that information. You have all your workers lining up. Let's say they're socially distancing. They're in a line. They're all waiting to get their temperature taken, but they are all a few of them, or a big portion of them, are within earshot and can hear the manager or whoever's taking the worker's temperature telling the worker what their temperature was. That could be a technical violation of HIPAA issues because you're not protecting that worker's information and keeping it private. So what you want to make sure you're thinking of is, can you set up a process or a system for taking people's temperatures privately behind a screened area, in another area where verbally the information, or you're just not simply communicating that verbal information at that time, but you're then following up with that worker in a private setting where maybe they do have an elevated temperature. So you're going to want to consider how you have that process set up, especially if you have a lot of workers that you're trying to screen all at once. A couple of other things you want to consider is the person taking the temperatures of the workers did not have to be a healthcare provider, but they should have training on how does the thermometer work they're using. You should really just be using those infrared ones where you can scan somebody's body temperature from a distance. They should be being trained on keeping the workers' information confidential, not sharing it with other people. They should also have personal protective equipment, face mask, gloves, practicing sanitation before and after the processes of testing people's temperatures. But again, it is allowed. It is recommended for screening. There's just some things you don't want to do it haphazardly and create more headaches for yourself than you did had you not been doing it. Anything else you want to add on temperature checking, Sean?
No, I think you pretty well covered that.
Okay, good. And then some of the other FAQs I want you to pay attention to, and then we'll jump into your questions here that you asked during the webinar. The 30 days employment for expanded the emergency family medical leave, that is number 14 on the DOL's FAQ site, so go look at number 14. For calculating different types of part-time and seasonal pay, you'll want to go look at number 5. That gives a good explanation on part-time workers. Number 75 deals with seasonal employees, and numbers 80 through 82 talks about if you have workers that are working irregular hours, irregular shifts, how do you figure out their wages? The last one I wanted to draw your attention to again was FAQ 58 and 59. That's that small business exemption when you have 50 or less employees and you're wanting to apply the exemption for the paid sick leave or the expanded family medical leave when you have childcare as the COVID-related event. So that's 58 and 59. Now let's jump into some of the questions we have here. One of these here, what about separate corporate entities? Oh, okay, that one I'm going to, because it's going to take me some time, I don't have it off the top of my head, but the question was, what about separate corporate entities that have common ownership? Do we count employees in each business, or do we have to count all the businesses with the same ownership? Sean, do you know that answer off the top of your head?
My understanding based on the regulations is that it's treated similarly to FMLA. And so if we're talking about joint ownership, you need to be doing the analysis to see if under FMLA, you would be considered joint employers. And that's something that you kind of need to look at the facts and circumstances. So it might apply to you or it might not, but you want to look at it to make sure.
Okay. And what I'll do too is after the webinar, some of these I will try and find the FAQ numbers and respond to you with the specific area where there might be an FAQ that you can refer to on these. Next question that came in, let's see here. What if an employee says that they are experiencing symptoms, however, they do not want to get tested? As employers, can we require them to self-quarantine for the 7 to 14 days? So let's answer that question first. Yes or no, can we require them to self-quarantine?
You can require them to remain away from work, and whether or not they self-quarantine, that's a little bit more difficult for you to enforce, because what they do in their own time is their business.
Right.
But you can require them, and you should require them to stay away from work, because I'll tell you that the Department of L&I interprets your obligation under OSHA and WSHA to provide a safe and healthful workplace to actually impose an obligation on you to keep sick or potentially sick employees away from the workplace. So I would say that if they're experiencing symptoms or they potentially have been exposed, they're to remain away from the workplace for at least 14 days and 72 hours after they've last experienced symptoms.
Okay. And then if you do, let's see here. If so, what if they come back and a month later start symptoms again, and this time get tested and they have COVID-19? However, they now have exhausted all of their emergency paid sick leave from the first round of symptoms. Well, in this case, if they used up, again, it's that cap. It's 80-hour cap or 2 weeks cap for the emergency paid sick leave from April through December. Okay. And then there was another comment here. Concerned employee could say they were forced to go home without having positive test, and now that they really are sick, they don't have enough emergency paid sick leave left to use. And no need to be sorry. That's what we're on this webinar for this long question.
Yeah, and so my thought there is, well, I'm just going to assume that whatever they used the first round of emergency paid sick leave, that it actually was, they did qualify for it, and that would mean that they went and sought diagnosis. And so you're probably fine there. We're just going to assume that this next round, you need to be thinking about, all right, do they have Washington paid sick leave available for use? Tell them they can apply for Washington paid family and medical leave, and it's up to the Employment Security Department to determine whether or not they're entitled to that. That's not your decision. If you have any other leave benefits available to employees, allow them to use vacation or whatever if you have that. So those are the different paid entitlements they might be entitled to. But the fact that they already used up their emergency paid sick leave doesn't change the fact that you need to keep them away from the workplace, because you got to keep everybody else safe.
Okay, good point. Next question here. Can we have a company policy requiring the employee to fill out a written form requesting, notifying the employer of FFCRA? Not necessarily a doctor's note, but requesting, documenting to the employer. And I think the answer, because FFCRA says verbally, I don't think we can necessarily have a policy like we might with Washington paid sick leave. What's your take on that, Sean?
I think that's the gray area that I was referring to before. I think you're right that the FFCRA says it can be orally or in writing, but then towards the end of that regulation, it says that if the employee doesn't provide sufficient information for you to qualify for the tax credits, then you're not required to give them the leave, and the IRS requires that it be in writing.
Right.
So yeah, you might be able to require them to put it in writing, but I just don't know that that's a road that I'd want to be going down, and you're kind of splitting hairs. And so I would just say, you have a general policy of asking employees to, but if they give it to you orally, have a supervisor write it down and maintain that documentation.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely a good best practice to create a policy in a form that people can submit. But to say you're going to hold the line and say, well, if you don't fill this out or submit what we've asked for, we're going to deny the leave, even though you verbally told it to us. I don't necessarily know. Like you said, I would take that fight up. Yeah,
you're not going to be looking in the best light if if that's the hill you want to die on.
Right. Yeah. Next question we got here from the group. The choice of using Washington paid sick leave versus FFCRA paid sick leave, or both, is it decided just by the employee?
I think the short answer is yes, probably yes. I kind of discussed that earlier, but the regulations, the way I read them, give the employee the option on which to use first.
Right. There's a thing here that in the presentation I gave, I used the word "or" several times related to the bullets of the COVID-19 events. When the worker themselves have COVID or has symptoms seeking medical diagnosis, or they're told to self-quarantine or isolate, is the "or" appropriate, or do they need to have actual symptoms? This is important because a worker can have COVID-19 but be asymptomatic. That is correct. Very good point. In this situation, having symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis would be just one of the qualifying events. The "ors" are in there, and I pulled those right from the way the rules and their websites written out. I believe I did, and if I didn't, I apologize for that. But what I was just trying to point out could be any one of these or combination of these scenarios. So now the person could be asymptomatic, could have gotten a test that says they have COVID, and so we know they're positive for it. They would then likely be told by somebody they need to be self-quarantining. That's sort of the rule of thumb. I believe in that scenario, the person would be qualifying to receive this benefit. Sean, you have any different take on that?
No, I agree. I think that's kind of an interesting point that they didn't really think about, is maybe there's a doctor that commits malpractice and doesn't advise them to self-quarantine. The regulations and the actual statute assumes that the doctor is going to advise them to self-quarantine if they have COVID-19. And I think that we just have to make that assumption right now as well. If somebody says that they have COVID-19, you're going to tell them to stay away from the workplace. And if the employee wants to use their paid sick leave, then they need to tell you that their doctor told them to self-quarantine.
Right, right. Next question we have here. When is an employer required to provide notification of other available leaves?
That's really going to depend on the circumstances, and that's why I recommend having that list that just reminds you of all the different leaves that you got to be thinking about. And I know Rick's heard me say this in other boot camps and things like that, where I say every individual leave you keep in its own box, and when somebody requests time off due to illness or whatever, you want to go through each of them in your mind to see, well, wait, do I need to provide notices here? Because with FMLA, it's you need to give it to them if they may qualify for FMLA. So if they may have a serious health condition, you need to get that notice out. That's oversimplifying it. But with the ADA, it's if you have reason to know that they may need a reasonable accommodation. Again, that's oversimplifying it. But so you need to go through each of these steps, and depending on what you learn or what you reasonably should know from the employee, that's going to determine what notices need to go out.
Right. Good point.
The FFCRA itself does not require you to issue notices that somebody may qualify, other than the posters and just the general notice obligations. I mentioned the letters and things like that because that's, I think, a good practice to show that you are trying to advise them of their rights and to also keep the workplace safe.
Right.
And so if the question there was meant to ask strictly about the FFCRA, there technically aren't any particular notices that need to go out when you learn that somebody might qualify.
Yeah, and I think there's a follow-up question that came in from this same person or comment. could we just provide them a list of the leaves that are available to them and let the worker tell us what they want to use? And I think the answer right there would be yes. I think that would be perfect scenario. You're telling them, look, here's everything available to you. Do you or do you not want to use any of this leave for this particular scenario?
Yeah, and I wouldn't be stepping into the realm of trying to advise them of which is in their best interest, because if something goes wrong, they're going to blame you for it, and you don't want to be in that position. So yeah, tell them what might be available to them and let them decide.
Good point. Next question here, does the IRS credit still apply if you received a PPP loan or grant? I have not seen anywhere documented where if you are a business that received PPP funds where you're prohibited from submitting for the IRS credits. Now, the PPP was intended to help employers stay in business, and same with the IRS tax credit for employers. It's to entice employers to keep workers working even though they may be experiencing a workforce that is having COVID-19 events. So I have not seen anywhere where you're prohibited from still applying for the IRS credit. Okay.
Actually, I disagree. Sorry, Rick.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen anything. Go ahead.
I believe that the PPP, if you received that, you are not eligible for the FFCRA tax credits. Work with your tax professional on that, but I'm pretty confident about that.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. See,
the idea is that it would be a double dip.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Good point. Next one here. How do we avoid all HIPAA issues in all of this? Sean, any recommendations for the group?
This is a pretty broad one. I can give you some general advice. Make sure that only those people that need to know somebody's condition, that those are the ones that know. And outside of that, if somebody's wondering why Jimmy is off work today and it happens to be because he has coronavirus, you just say, I can't tell you that. It's not your business, get back to work. But you don't want to be telling anybody about anybody's diagnosis or symptoms, things like that. But this is where it gets tricky. I would recommend that if there's somebody that gets diagnosed with coronavirus or has symptoms or might have been exposed, that you are advising your employees that someone was in the workplace recently that may have been exposed to coronavirus, and so they should be aware that if they start to experience symptoms, that might be why, or if they want to go seek diagnosis, something along those lines. I think making employees aware is important, and if I recall correctly, the Department of L&I's guidance on these issues says that employers should be doing that. And so that ties into the obligation to provide a safe and healthful workplace.
Okay, good. Last one here. Can any of these leaves run concurrently?
Yes. So my understanding is that the federal FMLA, the ordinary FMLA, well, actually, I think that that's a gray area whether or not the federal FMLA runs concurrently with the new expanded. The federal FMLA does run concurrently with Washington State paid FMLA, but the expanded FMLA and the new emergency paid sick leave are on top of and in addition to any other benefits. So really what you should be assuming is that they're on top of or in addition to. I'm kind of doing double speak, but they're additional benefits. The concurrent nature would be the emergency paid sick leave being used in those first 2 weeks of the expanded FMLA. Any other benefits are going to be in addition, consecutive, not concurrent.
Concurrent. Okay. That wraps up our questions that were submitted. Thank you, folks. Those are all great questions. And I'm sure, reminder, this webinar was recorded. We will soon have it on our Washington Farm Bureau YouTube channel. And I will work to get you out a PDF copy of the PowerPoint after this is over. You should see it by later today or Monday in your email inbox. But if you've got more questions and info, again, here's my name, direct number, email, Sean's phone number and email. And then I just wanted to highlight a few other things that we've been doing with Farm Bureau Solutions. We've been running the Ag HR Bootcamp series. We have the Bootcamp 3, which is currently under development. This deals with HR risk management plans, your policies and procedures, and employee handbooks. Those will be coming the winter of 2020, 2021. We also have a Farm Bureau Solutions podcast, which we launched. You can find those on Spotify and iTunes. Just look for Farm Bureau Solutions. And then lastly, the YouTube videos we've been producing. Just pull up YouTube, type Washington Farm Bureau, go to the video section, and you'll find there we have worker safety, COVID-19 safety information for employers and employees, and the employees ones are actually in English and Spanish, so you could use them as a safety meeting to bolster your own safety program during these times. And then you should see an announcement soon, but our staff here at the Farm Bureau just created a heat stress training. Temperatures are rising across Washington. We got to get off the COVID train while it's still going along. There's a lot of other things to keep in mind. There's going to be an English-Spanish video that you could push out to your workforce. And this will, we believe it fits the annual training on heat stress. And so that, again, it's like a webinar that your workers can listen to and watch. You could text it to them, send it to an email, maybe even play it somehow up on a video for them. Socially distance, of course, in those safety meetings, but we're trying to create more of that digital content for you. With that, I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. Hopefully it was useful to you. And Sean, thank you for partnering with me on this. I appreciate your insight and correcting me when I get out of line. But that's why we work. That's why we work so well together. So, with that, thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend, and be on the lookout for future webinars. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thanks, Rick.